Kia ora hui, hui mai tātou, no mai, haere mai. Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar discussing groupthink and is it ruining our democracy and what's the role of the online world in all of this. My name's Kim Connolly-Stone. I'm the Policy Director at Internet New Zealand and I'll be your MC for this evening. As you know, tonight's event is brought to you by the folks at Transparency International New Zealand and is part of Te Herena Waka, Victoria University of Wellington's Leadership Week, which is an awesome week of free online sessions that are open to the public and which aim to inspire action on the issues that matter. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, we've got a couple of notes on how we're going to run the session, a bit of housekeeping, and you would have seen some of this on the intro slide before we got started. First up, we'll have our presenters, each giving presentations. These will be about 10 minutes long, and there'll be a Q&A session at the end after both speakers have presented. We'll be managing the questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. So if you have a question, do please post it in the Q&A, and you've also got that opportunity to vote up questions that others have asked. I'll be doing my best to get through all the questions. I might have to group some together, and we just apologise in advance if we can't get to them all, because we have got 82 attendees so far, so that's amazing. Now, if you do have any technical issues during the session, please type these into the chat because we've got a really cool behind the scenes team that might be able to help you out, and they'll do their best. And just keep using that chat to, introduce yourself, say where you're from, and if you've got comments that you want to make that aren't necessarily questions, the chat is there for that as well. Now, our speakers have kindly agreed for us to record tonight's session. So because we're recording and we want to protect your privacy, that's why we set the Zoom sessions so that your mics aren't on, your video's not there, and you can't accidentally share your screen. And as I've mentioned before, we'll use the Q&A instead. Also letting you know that we have an electronic live transcriber for tonight's event. So if you'd like to access the Google Doc that the transcribers are using, just pop in the link to that Google Doc is in the chat as well. So that's all the housekeeping. Thanks for bearing with us on that. And before we get going, I'd like to hand over to Suzanne and Karen from Transparency International New Zealand and Victoria University of Wellington for a few words. I think you need to mute yourselves, unmute yourselves.
I thought that was going to be done for us. So, okay, can tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. A warm welcome from the Brian Pico Chair in Ethical Leadership, which is one of the co-organizers for these events, to our students, the TINS members, and others who are joining us this evening. Also, a big thank you to our speakers Sanjana and Josie and MC Kim, who will lead this important discussion about the state of our democracy and our role as citizens to make it work together. The Brian Pico Chair in Ethical Leadership regularly hosts seminars and webinars on ethics, and on Tuesday evening, the 25th of August, we will partner again with Transparency International New Zealand for an event here at the Business School. Please feel free to also then join us for a discussion with 2020 election candidates from across Wellington who share their insights and perspectives on business and political integrity during our recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. And you can register again through our websites. So again, welcome, and I would like to pass the word to Suzanne.
Kia ora, thank you. Thank you very much, Karen. TINS is delighted to be working with the Brian Pico Chair in Ethical Leadership on this function this evening, on this webinar, during this Leadership Week program. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Transparency International, and by the way, I've noticed that there's a lot of international attendees tonight. Thank you for coming on. In New Zealand, we are one of about 100 chapters of the global organization Transparency International. We promote transparency and integrity as antidotes to corruption. We back this up by specifying frameworks that enable this to operate in the public, private, and NGO sectors. And it's through discussions like this that we widen the challenges that you have with the nuances around what this actually means in practice. So welcome, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Suzanne and Karen. And it sounds like there's some awesome events coming up this week, so check them out. But without further ado, I'd love to introduce the first of our two fabulous speakers that we have tonight. First up, we have Sanjana. Sanjana is a recognized thought leader concerning technology, media, extremism online. He's, amongst many other things, he is special advisor to the ICT for Peace Foundation, a senior researcher at the Centre for Policy Alternatives in Colombo, and currently reading for his PhD at the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies here in New Zealand at the University of Otago. Sanjana's got a great presentation for us. He's going to talk about the promises that technology has made and perhaps how the reality is a little bit different, and talk us through some really interesting concepts: authoritarian amplification, continuous partial attention, and conformity as peer currency, and offering recommendations for us as individuals, thoughts for what governments and corporates should be doing. It's going to be a fantastic presentation. So Sanjana, over to you.
Thanks very much, Kim. Let me just share my screen here, get to my presentation. And hopefully everybody can see that. Wonderful to be here with you this evening. I would like to spend 10 minutes outlining the landscape as I see it around the topic that we have to discuss in front of us. Now, I have to be very careful because I'm a guest in your country and I know nothing really of the politics that govern it. So it's a bit like vomiting on the Pope. I hope I don't offend anybody by what I have to say. I try to steer away from New Zealand politics and, in a sense, go to my comfort area of Sri Lankan politics and groupthink on social media and how it impacts politics in a global sense, but also around my country. I think it's not a topic that we are going to have any kind of consensus or any clear answers at the end of this evening. And that's part of why I think it's important to have this conversation. As I see it, there are new challenges that confront us as citizens that haven't been around in decades prior to that which we are living in. The slide you see up there is a result of my work here in Otago. On the left, you see, in a sense, the discussions on Twitter in Sri Lanka. And on the right, you see the discussions on Twitter in New Zealand. Now, what's interesting, and to many of you who are familiar with space, this might look like something out of the Hubble telescope, looking at the far reaches of our Milky Way. This country, for example, is wonderful at seeing constellations. And this is not unlike one of those constellations that you would see from space. What you see in front of you are, in a sense, rather traumatic moments for both countries. On the right-hand side, that's a capture around 3 weeks after the Christchurch massacre. And on the left, that's around 3 weeks after the Easter Sunday terrorism last year in Sri Lanka, which killed hundreds. So very traumatic events. And what I do in my doctoral research is to look at the manner in which conversations at a national level occur in response to, reacting to, complementing, contrasting, debating these kinds of traumatic events, as well as political developments and other moments of interest in Sri Lanka. But when I was here doing my research, I found it interesting to look at Christchurch. And by the way, Twitter and the University of Otago have undertaken a research project to look at how Twitter in New Zealand reacted to the Christchurch massacre. I'm looking at data 6 months prior to it and 6 months after it. And that research is going to be public later on in the year. But this is what I do. I look at the manner in which conversations on social media evolve and why they evolve in the way that they do. Some of you, and we have an international audience, I don't know whether anybody is from the Middle East though, but just over a decade ago, there was this spirit of optimism, naive perhaps to now take a look at it, but it was a spirit of optimism that the promise of the democratization of technology, of social media, blooming and blossoming among citizenry, was that populists and authoritarianism and authoritarians would be overthrown, and democratic institutions and frameworks would be placed in countries which had never enjoyed democracy and all that comes with it for decades. So there was this expectation around the dividends of social media and the hope that the production and the promotion and the pitch of this content would strengthen democratic traditions or strengthen, entrench, and expand newly established democratic traditions in countries, as I said, which had only known authoritarianism for many decades. This was, if you recall, loosely and inelegantly called the Arab Spring moment. And of course, now we are older, better, and wiser. This backdrop is from my own country, Sri Lanka, at around the time when I came from my doctoral studies in March 2018. To cut a long story short, in that time, in that month, the country saw till then some of the worst communal violence that it had experienced for decades against the Muslims in a city called Kandy and its environs. This made the New York Times top of the fold headlines. It was that bad. And one of the reasons it did that was because of the role, the reach, and the relevance of social media in inflaming the violence. It didn't create the conditions for the violence to occur, but it created this tsunami of public opinion that weaponized communal distrust over decades and resulted in the normalization of heinous violence against a community. So today around the world, you find this general hesitation to grasp the early potential of social media and democracy, simply because there's a lot of bad around. I don't want to get into it because I think the media is full of it, but there's a lot of demonization, there's a lot of discontent, particularly amongst the young folk in all our countries, here as well as in Sri Lanka. And I think there's a lot of interest in the seed, the spread, and the seizure of that early potential by some of the worst elements in society. And here we have the president of Sri Lanka, elected in November 2019. This man genuinely frightens me. I won't go into too much because I think the record is public, but in a sense, I put this up as a symbol of the kind of individual that you have with Duterte, with Trump, with Bolsonaro, with Orban, across both sides of the Atlantic, and in many other countries as well, where the individual founded on populism and authoritarian trends and frameworks supported by social media rises into almost absolute power. So academics call this bully pulpits now, where social media gives rise to individuals like this, an easy vector of amplifying their message. And a complete reversal from a decade ago, where you have now authoritarians as the greatest engineers of populism and the entrenchment of their power through social media. And a lot of it is because a lot of people think that that is the only way that one can think and do things. I selected these two photos. I actually spent some time trying to pick them out because both of them, decades apart, are from the New York subway. And I think that visually it's very, very clear how things have changed, several decades ago. But I suppose in the lifetime of some of the people on this Zoom call, you had public transportation where you actually looked at the other person and talked with them. And if you didn't look at the other person, you were probably engrossed in a newspaper or you tried to have some kind of conversation. Nobody was engrossed in what you have in the other photo, which is a completely distinct difference where everybody's engrossed in their mobile phones and in their own worlds. There's a researcher called Linda Stone who called this continuous partial attention. Today, to cut it short, we are all the time. Right now, I'm sure many of you would be because we can't see you, I can't see you, nobody can see you, checking their phones, looking at their iPads, probably checking some notification that comes up, posting on Facebook that the Sri Lankan speaker is an idiot and doesn't know what he's talking about. And so we are always multitasking, and it's a real challenge. There's a psychosocial part to this, but one of the things that hooks it to our topic today is that we are gripped by information that doesn't inform us really, and we mistake all the time virality, i.e. popularity, for veracity, i.e. truth. And this is a real challenge. It's a challenge in New Zealand. It's more of a challenge actually in Sri Lanka. And that's when we come to groupthink. And for me, and I think that we can talk about groupthink later on, there's a real cost of speaking out today. And it's comfortable just fitting in and being silent and then going with the flow, going with the herd, as it were. And many young people I've spoken to seem to tell me that it's more challenging to speak out than it is to, even in peer groups, by the way, than it is to kind of just let go with the flow and then just let things happen and evolve. And that's why I called it peer currency. Conformity is peer currency. Here in Dunedin, for example, all of the young undergrads seem to wear the same kind of jeans, the same kind of outfit, and it's the sameness. There is no dare to be different attitude. And in a sense, that can be a metaphor for our public conversation as well. There are real costs in Sri Lanka around speaking out and speaking up, but there seems to be the same kind of reticence and hesitation here in New Zealand as well. So what can be done? I don't want to take Josie's time, and she has some fantastic slides, I think, that will follow up after me. And I peg it to 3 levels: the individual, the state, and the corporate, i.e. the Silicon Valley moguls who handle our platforms. As an individual, as citizens, I think this is a really hard conversation to have in Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka is a country of voters. We have a very loose, embryonic sense of citizenship. But I think broadly speaking, as citizens, as individuals in a democracy, as individuals in a country, it would behove us to be intentional in what we consume, to be critical in questioning what we consume. And I always say, consume widely, be liberal in our consumption, but conservative in your engagement. Conservative not in the political sense, but be reflective, being thoughtful around what one consumes. So it's eating a lot, but then as time goes by, selecting actually what you like to eat and what you like to consume. And then in terms of consumption, also have set times. Don't fall prey to the notification hostage situation, which we all, I am actually quite guilty of all the time, because the damn things keep popping up and you are distracted all the time, and it really taxes your mind. At the state level or the government level, I think New Zealand's got a handle on this. Sri Lanka does not. The importance of education in the main, and civic and media literacy in particular. And I know this can't be stressed enough. And it goes back to the point I made earlier around this confusion around information and popularity being conflated with truth and veracity. And I think, again, New Zealand is rather good. I mean, this current campaign about hearing racism by the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, it's about confronting that which is an inconvenient truth, grappling with it and talking about it, as opposed to shunning it. Sri Lanka does not do that. And one of the things is that we don't have a common narrative. We don't have something that binds us together as a society. And one of the things that social media does is that it splinters everybody and all the groups into the present, the past, and the future that they believe is true. But there is no glue that binds the country together in a common shared narrative. And that's a problem. And that, I think, has to start with education. And finally, the likes of Facebook, Twitter, and Google. I don't want to get too technical. Please ask me questions if you so feel moved to do so. But there's a lot that Silicon Valley and these, and I use the word consciously, horrible social media companies can do to make their products better, from a do no harm perspective through to engineering. There's things that individuals can do, but at scale, there are things that only these social media companies can do. And the technical word that some of us use is echo chambers. to get us out of that which we believe in and we hold true and we think is true, to kind of confront us with that which makes us slightly uncomfortable, but forces us to ask questions around our reality and what we believe and hold to be true. And there are things that these companies can do in a progressive way, in a democracy, to kind of introduce us to those things. So those are some of the thoughts I wanted to leave you with, and I look forward to the discussion that we'll have after Josie's presentation. Thank you very, very much.
And thank you so much, Sanjana. I can confirm that I was not distracted by any notifications during your presentation. You had my whole attention. Next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Josie. Josie is the Director of the Council for International Development. She has got a stellar background in communications and public affairs, having supported New Zealand's Prime Minister and a number of international organisations and NGOs. Tonight, Josie's going to talk to us about why politics have become so polarised and how this is playing out in social media and in what we call the non-virtual world. We're going to hear about tribal voting patterns, how to protect democracy, and how this is all likely to play out in the upcoming New Zealand and US elections. So Josie, this all sounds great. Over to you.
Yeah, I hope I can deliver on the promise of that introduction. Thanks, Kim. I'm just going to share my screen and make sure I get into the presenter mode. Just bear with me a minute. Yeah. Looking all right? Can you see that now? Yep. So yes, I'm sort of wearing two hats today, and Sanjana, that was a fantastic presentation. I'm trying to find ways to link it all, because I'm going to talk more about, I suppose, the real world of politics and how it impacts, I think, on all our communication platforms across social media. I thought I'd start because, yeah, I mean, I work, as you know, in aid agencies. As Kim said, I run an umbrella organisation for the aid agencies, but I also do political commentary. And I see on there's a lot of participants, friends and colleagues from both worlds. So I'm going to try and sort of unite those. And I think the thing that unites aid and development is, of course, politics. It's all political. And we're seeing the same sort of trends play out in aid and development. So starting off with a story really of a colleague of mine who will be familiar to you, Max Rashbrook, and we were talking a while ago about citizens' assemblies, and he was trying to convince me that these are really good ideas, and I was like, I'm not sure, you know, we've got Parliament. But we were agreeing that it's extremely important for democracy and to push back on some of this groupthink polarisation, that we have diverse voices and they're represented, and that too many groups in society feel excluded. They feel marginalised and vulnerable, and therefore they become silenced, and that's really dangerous. And we were nodding furiously, agreeing with each other. And then suddenly I said, hold on, Max, you're talking about identity. I'm talking about working class New Zealanders. So it was a kind of moment of revelation for us that we realised we were talking about completely different groups. But you know, I would argue if you look at our Parliament, representation of our Parliament, at our media, even in our social media and Creative New Zealand and what content gets funded, that we're doing pretty well on diversity in New Zealand and inclusiveness, and that's a really good thing. But I think the voice that's missing is an authentic working class voice, and I think often they're excluded. That voice is excluded from our mainstream politics and our media. In fact, we don't even talk about the working class, we talk about low-income people. So I suppose my mantra, or my kind of guiding principle, is that exclusion is always dangerous in a democracy, and it does lead to the sorts of trends that Sanjana was talking about. Elites are never good, on the right or the left, and making politics a religion where heretics are punished and you shield yourself, I suppose, from opposing views doesn't make those opposing views go away or bad ideas go away. And what it does is it drives it underground. So I know, looking globally, that, you know, the oldest and vastest exclusion that we've seen has been, of course, the exclusion of people of colour. And I'm quoting David Brooks from the New York Times here, where he said, exclusion from the commanding institutions of culture, which of course now is very much social media too. And, you know, if you look at recent events in the US, that kind of polarisation is shocking to us. And I'd have to say, we don't see that in New Zealand, and I hope we never do. And partly, I think, because parties of the right have not played that kind of politics. They haven't turned our treaty process, for example, into something that polarised the nation. They've got behind it. And so I don't think we're in a situation in New Zealand where we're facing these kinds of polarisations, but we are in what I would call an unacknowledged culture war. And I think that's the bigger threat for us. And you see it playing out in social media, you see it playing out in the real world. So of course we know what real polarization looks like. This is, I mean, America feels virtually ungovernable now. And just to take some of the examples that Sanjana was using and add to them, I mean, this was Iran just a few months ago when COVID was hitting. This is a couple of weeks ago in Eastern Russia, a protest against Putin, brave to do that. And of course, if you look at what polarization really used to look like, if we go back to the rise of fascism in Europe, I mean, it really was, if you look at what was happening in the 1930s, you were seeing the beginnings of disintegration of communities and an acceleration of groupthink, if you like, where politically suspect civil servants were being fired, where cultural and scientific cleansings were being carried out, and everything un-German had to disappear, books and so on. So if that was happening now, you know, we would be, the kind of censorship would be happening all through social media, as we see in places like China at the moment. But I suppose I would argue, not wanting to make any comparisons with Nazi Germany, but that an intellectual segregation on the left has been bad too. And Sanjana talked about conformism. And I think there's a danger that as progressives, we've become quite insular, we've become quite conformist. We tend to protect ourselves from heretics, and often we get blindsided by reality. If I go back here, you know, in the US, no one expected Trump to win, and he did win. We weren't paying attention. Something was happening and we didn't see it happening. And I think that's the danger if you are sitting in your own group and not really realizing what's happening under the surface. And I would say, you know, Trump won, and he didn't win because of social media and Facebook and Russian funding of Facebook. If we think that, we're missing the very real appeal of the populists. So this is back in 2017, where there was a big movement, I think, to ban Mike Hosking off the air. And while you know, many of us might disagree with his political views, the idea that you ban ideas that you disagree with isn't actually going to get rid of those bad ideas. And we talk a lot about cancel culture, I know, but the point is, it doesn't make the bad ideas go away, it makes them go underground. And when they go underground, people, whole groups get feel silenced, even if they're not being silenced. And I think if you go back to, if you look at the birth of the Labour Party, for example, in the UK, what's really interesting is that it really did emerge because politics was dominated by just some groups, certain groups, Whigs, the Tories, the Liberals. There was no voice for working class people. And, you know, in those days, you joined the Labour Party. If you were Keir Hardie and a miner, you joined the Labour Party to make your life better off. Today, of course, we often join the Labour Party to make somebody else's life better off. Now, that's not a bad thing in itself. It's a good thing, but it has transformed politics of the left, and it has potentially marginalised a working class voice. Now, my colleague in the UK, who may be familiar to some of you, Deb Mattison, she runs a think tank called Britain Thinks. She sums up this change really well. You know, 20 years ago, quite recently, if you talked about the Labour Party, an image, people would come up with an image of, you know, a pint and a pie in the pub. That was the Labour Party. Today, it's a bowl of quinoa in a wine bar. So there's been a transformation of our politics progressive politics on the left. And to put that another way, Thomas Piketty, who of course you all know, charted it, the change here. So you go back to the 1950s, where most people who voted on the left would have had very little education and would be predominantly working class voices. And then you cut through back to today, and it's predominantly people who are highly educated, even with PhDs. Now, again, that's not a bad thing, but the problem is you do end up with, I suppose, a reversal of who's in leadership roles in the left on political parties, and you can have a disjointed disconnection between the people you're meant to be representing and the people who are actually leading. And there can then emerge this kind of sneering, if you like, of the views of people you don't agree with. The food they eat, the cars they drive, the content, the TV they watch. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I think, Thomas Piketty talked about the Brahmin left, this sort of sense of a priesthood, a high priesthood that it feels a need to instruct people on how to live their lives. So that immediately is an alienating thing. This is a quote from Paul Collier's book, I think it's called The Future of Capitalism, but he talks about 6 core values that drive all voters: loyalty, fairness, liberty, hierarchy, care, and sanctity. And if you think about it, parties on the left do very well with fairness, parties on the right do very well with liberty. But the winning combination, and this is what's really interesting, because a winning combination, if you think back to Jacinda in 2017 and Labour, or even John Key in 2007, is a broad church appeal to lots of different groups in society, and triggers many of those qualities, not just 1 or 2 of them. Going back to Deb Mattison again in the UK, she tried to sort of analyse this as 3 core groups in society that if you want to win elections, if you want to have successful politics, you need to appeal to all 3. The first is settlers, traditional working class. Second, she calls prospectors, the aspirational middle class and lower middle class. And the third one is pioneers, progressives, social liberals. And the winning combination appeals to all of those. But she argues that what's happened is that the pioneers are now running parties on the left, and that means they've become a lot less tolerant of the views of the settlers or even the prospectors. And that's where you get a shift, so rather than disagreeing with other people's views, you start disapproving of them. And then you start to really metastasize this groupthink. And it's interesting to look at what is it that the populists, and Sanjana talked about, listed a whole heap of them. What is it that is the appeal of the populists? And partly it's optimism. I mean, there is no more optimistic political slogan in recent times than "Make America Great Again." It's also about belonging, and a sense that, if you feel you haven't got a voice, suddenly you have got a voice. If you're being sneered at, suddenly you feel confident, So we've got to be really aware of the appeal of the populists and think, well, how can we be more optimistic, and how can we offer more hope? In New Zealand, I mean, this is just a quick summary of what those categories look like here in New Zealand. We've got a working class job, an aspirational lower middle class family, and of course Jacinda, who personifies a sort of progressive left. And even the Frizzell image there is very much signalling a belonging to a certain progressive group. I think the answer to this is, how do we avoid getting into that polarization that you see in the US and elsewhere and across Europe? Is you've got to listen to all of those different groups. And this is a poll that came out, I think, not that long ago, about a month ago, about what are the issues that are driving New Zealanders right now into this election. And right up the top there is economy, housing, jobs, healthcare. Interesting, and this is not my own, not putting my own personal views away from this, but you look down there, climate change is quite far down. Immigration is quite far down. So part of what we've got to do is be prepared to really listen to the things that are driving people in their everyday lives. And that would be the same as aided and development too. We know in the Pacific, every single Pacific country, even those most affected by climate change, the top 3 issues for people living in those countries: jobs, health, and education. So climate change is there, but those are the things that people are really focused on. And this is the famous Edelman barometer, the trust barometer. And what I find interesting, this is the most recent one from about February, I think. What's interesting about this is that you can see income inequality is the greatest influence on a decline in trust in governments and institutions. And institutions is, you know, mainstream media and so on. So inequality drives the kind of divisions and polarizations that we're seeing overseas. And it's something that we know from our polling here, people want governments to address. So this is, actually, I'll go to this slide now, because colleagues of mine in this think tank called More in Common have, More in Common was a think tank that started in England after an MP was murdered there during some of the nastiest Brexit sort of tensions, and her legacy emerged into her friends and colleagues setting up this think tank called More in Common. And the whole drive was to find the things that unite us rather than divide us. And what's interesting about this, they looked at tribal these values, how are people fitting themselves into tribes these days, rather than political allegiances to, say, the Labour Party or the National Party or Democrats or Republicans and so on, Tories, Labour. And if you just looked at the US, for example, and I'm sure it would be we could do a similar thing in New Zealand, it's pretty much 50-50. 50% think immigration's good, 50% not so good. Same with feminism, same with gender and sexuality, race, and so on. Now, if you dig down into the tribes, what you get is progressive activists, absolutely nearly 100% think that immigration, for example, just taking immigration as an example, is a positive. Devoted conservatives, right at the other end of the spectrum, nearly 100% think it's a bad thing. You can see how the tribes, what you think about parenting, whether you think creativity is more important than discipline, whether you drive an electric car or a petrol car, all of these values and tastes are driving our politics now. And so, if you're a progressive activist, you're going to think that immigration is good and so on. But the good news about this, I suppose, is that in the middle, and they call it this exhausted middle, are most people. So most people are sick of the hate speech. They're also sick of what they call, not my words, but political correctness. So that tells you that in the middle, you've actually got a lot of people who feel really good about social liberalism, actually. They're positive about, same-sex marriage. It's only really on the fringes that you're getting this kind of disintegration. And so I suppose our challenge really is to look at how we talk to that exhausted middle. And again, it comes back to, giving people a sense of optimism, a sense of hope, owning the future in a way that the populists have been doing extremely successfully, consciously reaching out to different communities that are not like you, and listening, not sneering. And that kind of sense of authentic leadership where you have people talking from a real place, not feeling like they're political sort of professionals. And the really good news when we're looking at what unites us rather than divides us is, I think, this, where, and this is some YouGov polling that was done last year, maybe a bit longer than that. But on the whole, most people, whether you're working class blue collar worker or you're way up there at the other end of the spectrum in the LGBTQI group, whether you're ethnic minority, middle class, woman, or so on, just about everybody wants to see something done about inequality, and they support redistribution of wealth. So that tells me that if you deal with inequality wherever you see it, if you reach out across your groups. And if you celebrate the values and the culture of different groups, including working class New Zealanders, then actually we're going to have the best possible approach to dealing with any emergence of polarisation in New Zealand. So yeah, there's a lot to be hopeful about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josie, just for those starting thoughts on how we can avoid that polarisation. Now we're at Q&A time, and we can see there's a few questions coming in the Q&A, questions and comments there. As MC, I get first dibs on asking a couple of questions of our fabulous panelists. So I'll bear with me as I do that, and then I'll get to what we have in the Q&A. Sanjana, if I could start with you with a little question that I have. You may be aware, as part of the New Zealand government's response to the Christchurch terror attacks, it indicated it was going to make a number of changes to domestic law and policy, and in particular to have a look at the laws that regulate media, in particular how they cover social media. So my question to you is, if you got to decide what the terms of reference for that government review was, what do you think should be in scope?
This is the question that gets my visa revoked and a very quick deportation. No, but I think that, well, listen, I think there are policy experts here in the audience who know about this much more than I do. I have two broad answers, if it can be seen in that manner. One is that it matters what New Zealand does to more than New Zealand. And that might be somewhat confusing to those here. And I say this because a lot of other countries look at New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe, and then try to bring about domestic legislation that echoes what they say have been done in those countries. And that's sometimes a problem. Australia after Christchurch, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, the current conversations around Section 230 in the United States as a consequence of what Trump is trying to do. These are slightly technical, but they all suggest that for domestic reasons, when these governments that are seen as by countries like mine to be the beacons of democracy, they bring about legislation and regulatory frameworks that really impinge around the freedom of expression. That becomes then an excuse for authoritarians to say, look, they did that, so we are going to do the same. And of course, the veneer is that the polish is that, we are doing this to protect citizenry, but really it's a chilling effect. And so it matters that New Zealand gets this right. It's something that, if I may just stress and urge, it's not something that local policymakers often think about and arguably do need to think about, but it does matter for the rest of the world that this is done right and follows the wide global recognition and acceptance of the Christchurch call and the parameters that the call was around that you can build on as well. And listen, again, David Kay, the just retired Special Rapporteur of the United Nations for Freedom of Expression, 2 years ago came out with a document that was tabled at the sessions that built on the Manila Principles of Intermediary Content Regulation in 2014. And then towards the end of the document had two sets of recommendations, one for social media companies and another for government. And it's really very simple. There are a couple of things that I think New Zealand can very easily adopt and adapt. One is that the regulations need to be based on judicial independence and not government authorities. It needs to have a legal framework and not at the whims and fancies of a political party or what might be a very popular government. There needs to be transparency and accountability. For example, with content takedowns, it needs to be extremely restricted, governed by rules, overarchingly governed by the principle of the freedom of expression and human rights protection. And it has to be very, very clearly circumscribed because otherwise overreach very quickly leads to a chilling effect as well, even in mature democracies. It should be standards based. And I think that one of the things that is in the recommendations that states should have some sort of a transparency report, a scorecard, a report card. And that if this kind of regulation and legislation and regulatory framework is embarked upon, that there needs to be a public conversation yearly, annually, if possible, with citizens around what the government did and why. And so that there is review and discussion around the regulation as well. So it's not just set in stone. And that's really important, because that's what authoritarians don't like. They like to propose and push and promote something with a paternalistic kind of bent, suggesting that this is good, and obviously they don't want any kind of discussion around that ever after. So these are broad principles. I know that the evening is already late and it gets really technical very, very quickly. But for those of you who are interested, this is a public document. The vanilla principles are a public document. David Kay has written more. And also social media companies have also come a long way in a few years. They are rather supportive now of regulatory frameworks, though the jury's out on that. I mean, what they call regulation and what we would like as regulation are two different things. But I would like to end by urging you to think of a progressive way forward that helps countries like mine also construct frameworks along these lines. It's really important that New Zealand gets this right. And I don't want to name names, but countries neighboring New Zealand haven't got it right. And David Kay has written about this, and we really shouldn't go down that path.
Thank you very much, Sanjana. And I think we can pass on those comments to the government departments doing this review. Josie, a question for you. I was really keen to sort of tap into your journalistic background a little bit as well. As we come into the general election, the threat of misinformation is a real issue, isn't it, for us when we're trying to decide to look at policies of the candidates and whatnot. Where do you think New Zealanders should be going for their information in the lead up to this election? And are there special roles for mainstream media in this or not?
Yes, quick answer, yes, absolutely there are roles for mainstream media, because you've still got a lot of people who will be accessing information via mainstream media. Yeah, I mean, I really admire the policy that the Greens have of having their policies costed, of really detailed analysis of who's going to pay. The two questions, like, what are you actually going to do, and what's the detail of it, and granularity of it, and who's going to pay. And I think what we're seeing in the election is a slightly dangerous strand of and perhaps this is a criticism of the government, actually, of the Labor government, of thinking, well, we won't put any policy out there. We'll carry on governing, and everybody else can put policy out there. Well, actually, you do have to, and I take my hat off to both the Greens and the ACT parties, so both sides of politics, where they are putting out very detailed, granular policy. They're analysing how it's going to be costed, and they're coming up with sort of edgy stuff that you can disagree with, whether it's a universal benefit or whether it's an insurance scheme instead of an unemployment scheme. So I think there are two things about that, Kim, because there was a big, Trump got away with calling mainstream media fake news and anything he doesn't like fake news, because whole groups of people and communities in America felt like they weren't represented in that mainstream media, and so therefore, it's a chicken and egg thing. Like, yes, we need to make sure that there is information that can be relied on and that is not manipulated in any way. But we also need to be aware that people can only get away with accusing someone of fake news if we're not actually getting out there and putting stuff that people really want to listen to. So it's, yes, educate, but actually listen. Actually listen to what people are telling you their problem is, and then answer that, and then they'll listen. You know, last thing I'll say about it is, we always complain that no one votes in local elections, no one votes for DHBs, because we never know who the candidates are. But you try closing a hospital in a local community, and people will come out and vote for their who's on their DHB. So, you know, the onus is on us as much as it is on those who are manipulating for the worst possible reasons, the anxieties and angers of people who don't feel represented.
Thanks very much, Josie, for that answer. We're going to kick into the list of Q&A. Just a little reminder, if you've got questions, to pop them in the Q&A, not into the chat. I mean, we might try and catch them if they're in there, but it's easier if they're on the Q&A, folks. I'm going to start with the most upvoted questions. First up, a question from Howard Witten, who's really interested in the possibilities of using protected whistleblowing as a driver for transparency, accountability, and integrity in business. And it's sort of a view that actually, if we could change the perception of having more principled whistleblowing, would this make a difference? So would one of the panel like to comment on this whistleblowing question?
Josie, you want to take a crack at that? Because I have an answer, but I think I'll follow you.
Okay, well, let me say something very quickly. I totally agree, Howard. And I think, you know, whistleblowing in any democracy has, and when it works well, has been and is one of the best accountability mechanisms we've got. So, yeah, I mean, we do have whistleblowing legislation, of course, but you're absolutely right that it could be, you know, protected whistleblowing is certainly something that I think we should look at. But Sanjana, you've got something.
I completely agree with the both of you. My concern, not hesitation, my appeal to think about whistleblowing in 2020 is the implications of the information age we live in. It is no longer the case that anonymity and pseudonymity are guarantees or can be guaranteed. And if you do end up becoming a whistleblower, you don't have to go down the Edward Snowden route in a purely domestic sense. Depending on what you're revealing to the public, the perspective might give you away, the manner in which you do it might give you away, the manner in which you engage might give you away. And there are a dozen, if not more, hundreds of data trails and digital trails that make whistleblowing very, very difficult. I think it's a fantastic question. I have nothing against whistleblowing, but it comes with attendant risks and challenges that weren't there a few years ago. And that has to be really taken on board when and if you're going to do it.
And Sanjana, I'll just add to that because I think you're absolutely right. And the principle of whistleblowing doesn't necessarily mean that the content of the whistleblowing needs to be made public. That there needs to be the mechanisms to have that properly addressed so that you can sometimes protect any people who may well be damaged in that information going public. Yeah.
Thanks very much to both of you. My next question is going to be a little bit of a mashup of a few questions that we have on the screen, and it's about diversity. Anne Ball sort of kicked us off with this question: how can sort of diverse individuals and groups be heard in New Zealand? How can they be included rather than excluded? And sort of building on that, comments and questions from Brian Wilden and Kay Jones. You know, where's the Māori perspective in this? Chinese, Pacific, we've got very diverse communities in New Zealand. Would the speakers care to comment on this?
Yeah, maybe I'll just say something quickly about that because when I'm, you know, it's funny when I even hear myself say working class New Zealanders, I can feel people going, oh, you know, we don't have working class New Zealanders anymore. We're not like that. What I mean by that is, and in New Zealand it's quite distinctive. It is predominantly Māori and Pacific Island, as well as Pākehā. It is driven a lot by the church, by religion, importance of religion in communities, sports, and you know, a sense of a culture that I think is not a working class culture rather than an academic Māori culture or Pacific culture that is not necessarily being expressed in mainstream media. And I think you know, it's funny, I was thinking, of all the social media platforms we have, what is the one that I would say is the most authentically working class in New Zealand? And I think it's probably TikTok, to be honest, because, you know, in TikTok, you're getting a really authentic voice of that isn't necessarily debating the things that we're all debating tonight. But, you know, to answer your question, there are definitely ways in which we can incorporate a more diverse series of voices, whether Māori, Pacific or Pākehā, where we're looking at not just those who are have a mandate to express, feel they have a mandate to express what it is to be a Māori or Pacific experience, but actually looking at some of those communities where they may not have as strong a voice in mainstream media or even in politics.
Yes.
Karen and I would very much like to acknowledge the speakers, and in particular also the attendees, for their comments tonight. This topic has left us hungry for more and for more opportunities to talk about groupthink in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, so good. Also, thank you from us. I think that our time is up. So we hope to see you at one of our other events that we can even talk more about our democracy and the state of New Zealand. Thank you very much.
Well, well, everyone, the time has really got away on us. Thank you so much to our speakers and all of our attendees. It's been really lovely chatting to you tonight.